Welcome to Body Bags, presented by the Kokomo Lantern. My name is Jeremy Geiger, and I'm one of the co-owners of City of First Cremation and Funeral Services. Today I want to talk to you about funeral processions, some of the stresses on funeral directors, some of my experiences and stories. Some are pretty funny, some are a bit frightful. So, funeral processions here in the state of Indiana are pretty basic for requirements. Our state statute says that the vehicle needs to have a purple or amber flashing light to indicate that it's a procession, and that each vehicle needs to be marked somehow. So sometimes we see a funeral banner in the windshield. Prominently in Kokomo, we use a purple magnetic flag that goes on top of your vehicle. Some of our processions may be so large that we're spacing these flags out, that it's not every vehicle, maybe every other one or every third one that gets marked. When we're in procession, we can disobey some traffic laws. Not all of them, just some of them. So like the stop signs, we don't necessarily need to come to a complete stop, or stoplights. A lot of times we like to request for EMA support or police support to help guide us through those intersections. Because as we all know, as a driver, we're not always looking out for an amber or purple light. And if we did see a yellow or an amber light, we're probably thinking it's the mail carrier or some kind of surveyor, not necessarily that it's a 15 or 30 car procession and I need to stop and not bust this procession up. So that's where definitely the purple flags would help indicate that for the driver. Some of the stresses that I encounter with the processions is we're always looking for a particular order. I always like to have the spouse or the parents be the first vehicle behind the funeral coach. Typically I will go, then maybe spouse and children, and then parents, and then I do siblings after that. If it's a large family, I don't really get too wrapped up into knowing aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews and grandkids and getting them in order. I usually am concerned about the first 5 vehicles personally. Those are my main key players in the funeral service. And then I'll set up a secondary line for additional family. I always deal with the grandkids and the nieces and nephews. Some of them feel they need to be maybe closer than others because they may have been more involved. Depending on who I'm working in with the family, I will also know those dynamics on how I should address that person on where their parking requirements would be. There have been times where I've worked at funeral homes and you would pull in the lot and I would ask you if you're a family or a friend, and then pull your vehicle in either side of the lot, and I would drive then your car around and put it in the order of the procession that I wanted it in. It was helpful to a certain point because I got to put your car where I wanted it, not where you felt that it needed to be. When I'm working with a family during the arrangement conference or maybe the evening of visitation, I'll work out those details of who those first couple of vehicles are. I'll ask about the grandkids, nieces and nephews. I'll tell them how I'll have that secondary line. Usually my third and fourth lines for my procession parking are friends and neighbors. As I'm dealing with these cars coming in, there may be some individuals that are handicapped, that they may need a closer spot, even though that they may be the neighbor. If they're wheelchair bound or they're in a walker and they can't get along very well, and we've had rain or it's snowy, it's not going to work for them to be the 9th, 10th car in the procession to get them up to the grave. It runs another liability of them falling out the cemetery. So I may filter them in closer in front of the grandkids, so that way they don't have to battle some of those obstacles out at the cemetery, and it helps them get to their car a little quicker. The size of our processions in Indiana, they're not regulated. I've done a small procession of one vehicle following the funeral coach to several hundred following the funeral coach. I've done some really large ones where it was 10 miles from the funeral service to the cemetery, and I was parked at the gravesite when the last vehicle was leaving the church. So just kind of picture that in your mind of how big and how many cars we're talking about. Hundreds and hundreds of cars. It gets really interesting to coordinate that with the facility holding the funeral ceremony to make sure you've got ample parking. But it gets even more interesting on the cemetery side. There's not always open areas to park all these vehicles. So knowing the route into the cemetery, how many vehicles you can approximately fit on the drive, where to cut the line off to send them to park alongside the road of the cemetery, or maybe there's multiple drives and you're wanting them to go certain directions, so that way when they all exit, that they're not facing each other stuck in the cemetery. That way they can each make their turns for the exits heading out. So that's kind of getting them in order, driving them a little bit. Typically my speed in town, I'm around 15 miles an hour. Our state doesn't dictate whether we need to be at 10 miles an hour, at 30 miles an hour. It's just within reasonable conditions for your procession. The bigger the procession may be, the slower I'm going to drive. You've all probably witnessed funeral processions going out of the church or the funeral home. You know, they may take off real slow and the first 6 or 8 cars are doing good, and then cousin Johnny forgot to pay attention and he left a little bit of a gap, and here he comes, he's flying to catch up. So then there's this little bit of herky-jerkiness in that procession from cousin Johnny to the back. If we're hitting highway areas and not city and county roads, I'm gonna push more on that 45, 50 mile an hour on the highway just to help keep traffic going a little bit better. I typically will have pre-driven the route or have driven it in the past knowing the traffic flow. Some of our traffic here in Kokomo, you may find that it's better to be in a left lane versus the right lane, because you know eventually that right lane's gonna become a turn-only lane in about 5 lights. So you want to be prepared so that way your procession's not weaving in and out of traffic, because you can be passed in a funeral procession. It may sound crazy, but you legally could pass a funeral procession. I don't recommend it because it's not very respectful. What other neat things with traffic that might be interesting? One-way roads. Boy, those make me really nervous. When I worked in Elkhart downtown, all of our roads were one way, and it seemed like the lights were synced. We didn't have EMA, so if I was running south and I hit a red light and the east-west roads had a green light, they've had a green light for quite a while and they are going super fast, and they're not realizing I'm coming through that intersection with a funeral procession. So I would stop to make sure I caught those drivers' attentions to get them from busting up my procession. There were a few times where I thought, dear Lord, I'm gonna get T-boned and this is gonna be the worst car accident I've ever been through. But they caught it before it got terrible for me. outside of like the traffic laws, dealing with other drivers, it's pretty easy for us here in Indiana to run a procession with the correct support. I always like having that EMA or police being involved. But we deal with Mother Nature too, that can also throw a curveball for us for this funeral procession. You know, it may be nice and sunny when we start the funeral service, and when it ends, it could be raining. I always like to use a rain cover over our caskets to protect it from getting any raindrops on it. It's not that I think my casket's going to disintegrate or I'm going to ruin the finish. I just don't like to add extra moisture into that burial vault that we're getting ready to seal up. Another thing to maybe think about would be when we're dealing with the winter, or as we're experiencing right now, these extreme temperatures. I will go out and I will start up the funeral vehicles in some of the family cars. If it's cold, I want it to start warming up for them. If it's super hot, give that air time to get going and cool things off. They're going through a lot of emotions. They're building up this stress that they don't know how to contend with sometime, knowing that the casket's going to be closed, that there's a little bit of a journey to the cemetery, and they don't have much control over it, and they're at the mercy of the funeral home and funeral director to know that they're going to get that casket closed safely, coordinate with those pallbearers to get them loaded into the funeral coach, and to ensure the safety of all of their family and guests to get safely to that final resting place. So to eliminate some of these burdens, these small touches, putting a rain fly on, addressing each vehicle when we're getting ready to leave to let them know, turn on your headlights, turn on your four-way flashers. Your vehicle is marked with a purple flag to indicate you're in the funeral procession. Let that person know, hey, you're the first in this line, you're gonna follow the purple Nissan in the first line that comes by. Having staff out there to help direct them and give them guidance to make sure they don't miss that purple Nissan going by and half the procession's still there and you've done left them. Some people get in their mind, well, my car's marked as purple flag, my headlight's on, my flashers are going, I don't need to worry about it, let's go. You need to stay with that group in the procession. Make sure you talk to your funeral director about maybe some requests that you have. I've had some pretty interesting ones. I've had them where family members have said, can I drive the funeral vehicle? I want to give Grandpa their last ride. Sure, I don't have a problem with it. I'm going to ride with you, but you can drive if you want. I've had requests from family members that say, I want to go by the old farmhouse. I always love those. Or can we stop by such and such's house? We always spent the 4th of July there and it's close to the 4th of July. Absolutely. There was one family, I did a whole family tour parade. We went by the house that he grew up in, the house that he was married in, the family's house that he passed away in, and all of his sisters along the way to the cemetery. It was pretty neat. They put out American flags. He was a veteran. As we came to these houses and properties, I would come up slowly, pause, come to a complete stop. Some people even came out of the house, waved to us, took their hat off, put their head down, showed their respects. These are all things that you can request from your funeral home. Don't be afraid to ask them, hey, can we go a little bit out of the way? They're things that we enjoy. It's things that we like to do to honor that person's final wishes. It may have not been, as I've been preaching to you all, in your pre-arrangement. It may have been something you expressed to your family before you passed away. Hey, I like to go out to the Kokomo Reservoir along County Road 50 and fish. Can you make sure they swing by there and stop at my favorite fishing hole? My buddies will probably be there fishing on my funeral day, and they would appreciate to see that. Yeah, absolutely, that's easy. Does it add a little bit of extra legwork for you as a funeral director or for the funeral home? Possibly. And it would only be just to run that route to make sure there's no road constructions or road closures. See how big of an area that you got to work with to stop. If we're talking at a house, it may be a neighborhood that shares a driveway. It may be at the time kids are getting picked up by the bus for school or being dropped off from school. Those would be things that the funeral home would work through, but they wouldn't be yours to be concerned about as a consumer, just expressing what that wish would be. Other neat things we've done in funeral processions, we've used unique vehicles. I've loaded caskets into fire trucks. I've used pickup trucks. I've used race cars. It was a race pickup truck, but it was still cool. We've used a drag car once as the lead vehicle going to the cemetery. These are all things that can be expressed to the funeral home as a request for that funeral ceremony. Each funeral ceremony doesn't have to be the same. They're all unique and need to be personalized to fit each person's characteristics. It's super important. Express this to the funeral director. They may even pick up on it as they're gathering information for the obituary. Oh, Dad liked motorcycles? Does Dad still have a motorcycle? Is there any way we could have somebody drive that as a lead vehicle? Or, hey, we cremated him. Would you be comfortable in putting the urn on the back and you driving the motorcycle with them on the back of it to the cemetery? Just neat ideas. Some of the things that also have stressed me out, I mentioned Mother Nature. So I've had some interesting ones with Mother Nature. Torrential downpours, bitter cold. I can usually overcome those, but it's the kamikaze ones that really get me. So I've been pooped on by a bird standing out parking cars for the cemetery. I've had them poop all over the funeral vehicles, so then I'm out there cleaning them up before we go to the cemetery. One of my favorite ones was I was driving to a cemetery in Michigan, and a semi passed us on the highway, and it blew the light off the top of the funeral car and scratched up the driver's side and dented the door. As I'm trying to put the light back on top, next thing you know, a squirrel runs out in the road. And I slow down, and he starts running back towards the edge. I think I'm good and safe. Last second, little dude darts out, and I run him over. Doggone it, hope nobody's seen that. Wrong. As soon as we get to the graveyard, first thing they said was, I bet that was the craziest procession you ever had. I can't believe you hit that squirrel. I'm like, oh dear, let's not talk about the squirrel. What about the light that I had to throw back up on the roof? Yeah, that was pretty wild too, but that squirrel, I can't believe it. You hit it. Mother Nature, it's gonna throw you a curveball. Not only is the community maybe gonna throw you a curveball on an interesting request or maybe a difficult person to deal with on parking restrictions, but Mother Nature, it's completely unpredictable. You can never be overly prepared for that. Did I learn any lesson on that? No, I'm not gonna swerve and miss a squirrel still. That seems dangerous to me. Like I said, there's oncoming traffic. So yeah. That's kind of some of the unique things that I see with funeral processions. They can be done pretty well, I feel, by most funeral homes. And I always love when families have unique requests. I'm waiting for the one family to say, I want every person to listen to this song, and then they hand me a CD, or I have to burn 30 some CDs to hand out. to people so that way that we can all listen to the same song. I know that'll be one of my requests when I pass, because I want everybody to hear that same song that's uplifting on the way to the cemetery on that final journey. So to round things out on this episode, I've got some interesting stories. As you know, we do pet cremation, and boy, we've done some interesting ones lately. They kind of relate towards disinterments. We've had 2 disinterments this year. One of them was a person that lost their pets years and years ago, and now mom's selling the house and they can't stomach the thought of their pets being left behind. So we went out and we disinterred those pets. It took us two attempts to become successful. It's interesting at the age of 10 that you don't quite remember how deep you dug or exactly where that hole was. Time goes on and your memory fades a little bit. We dug up an 8-foot by 10-foot section about 1.5 to 2 foot deep in this gentleman's backyard to not find his puppy. We had to ask his mother to come over that evening and maybe mark the ground in a spot she felt was more accurate. Lo and behold, we were just about 5 inches off from our original hole on one of the sides of this massive area. We were able to recover both pets. We got them cremated and returned back to their owner. Overly excited and happy to have them back home and to know they're not going to be left there in that backyard. The other one was a little more recent for me. We had a lady who lost her pet. It was a very young pet on a very tragic, unexpected accident. I don't want to go into too many details other than be careful with your pets. Always expect the unexpected. She lost hers in a very terrible way, and she didn't know what to do with her pet. This was really her first pet loss. She's had family members that she's had to deal with, but not a personal pet, and she chose to bury her pet. She didn't get her pet buried very deep. She only had a couple of inches of dirt on top of her, and which still wasn't the biggest issue. But what the bigger problem was is she chose to wait about a week before she contacted me and realized that funeral homes can do pet cremations for her. We almost missed out on the opportunity to capture the paw print and nose print. The decomposition had progressed pretty far, but it wasn't due to her fault. It wasn't because the grave wasn't dug deep enough. It's because she wasn't expecting a death, and she didn't know what to do when a death occurred. So this is more or less talking to you pet owners out there. All of your veterinarians are able to help facilitate that pet cremation for you. Most of them have partnered with either a local funeral home or some kind of pet cremation society. So outside of reaching out to them, it may be expensive, especially if it's in the evening or on a weekend. You may run into some extra charges dealing with your vet clinic. Reach out to your local funeral home. Somebody you've always been dealing with, somebody that you trust. More than likely, they're going to be able to do that pet cremation for you, or they've got a resource that they can provide you to do that pet cremation. I know for the longest time here in Kokomo, there was only one other option for a local funeral home to do that cremation. Now we have a couple of options here in Kokomo outside of the veterinarian clinic to be able to do that. And on that pet cremation, it's not just maybe cremating and returning the ashes. There are some unique things that they're able to provide you outside of what the veterinarian clinic can do for you. We've done some, I don't want to call them public visitations, but we've done some private ceremonies or private IDs with the family with their loved pet before we packaged them up and got them ready for that cremation. I've included them on helping collect that paw print for them, even let them gather the fur clippings with me so that way we can put them in with the bookmark. These are all great things to help that pet owner with the loss. I see on the pet side of it, it seems to hurt way more than it does on the human side. I think some of it has to do with the connection to the pets being non-judgmental and not having anything other than unconditional love to their owner. It's interesting to see how hard it hurts these folks. I've lost a pet myself, and it was extremely hard for me. It took me quite a while to overcome the loss of Bandit and knowing that he wasn't coming back home in the form that I had him originally. I find a lot of comfort in the keepsakes that I have, though, that have Bandit's remains in them. He still gets to golf with me every chance that I go golfing, and I get to hold his ashes every day when I think of him. It's kind of crazy to think of, but we love our pets as much, if maybe not more, than our companion or our siblings, maybe even our parents sometimes. But it's interesting to share some of that knowledge with you. But that does kind of wrap up my conclusion of Funeral Processions, some of its intricacies, stressors to us as funeral directors, and to implant into you folks, as always, share with your funeral director some of your requests or ideas, because they're not out of reach. They're all doable things most of the time. But this does conclude my services today here at City of First Cremation. You all have a wonderful day.